He was driven, determined to try to do something to learn more about the illness that he had just learned of. He was concerned about having such a rare diagnosis and concerned that several of his friends and classmates seemed to have similar diagnoses. And they all reported having at one point in time played at the Nyanza site. The initial call was really, will government look into this? Will you help me to understand how I got sick and whether or not people have to worry?
When we could see and smell the colors when I was living on Union Street, and we shut the windows, not because we feared it was harmful to us, but just because it had a smell that you didn't necessarily want to smell.
I can remember, particularly on the cold mornings, I'm coming into town and it's 7 o'clock in the morning, cold winter light, and I would smell this industrial odor. And it was, I don't know exactly what it was, but it would be something on the order, it might be like lacquer thinner or one of the strong chemical odors. And obviously they were releasing it early in the morning.
So at my dad's house, a lot of woods behind his house. We used to be out there, which the woods led to the Ashland High School in one direction, and also if you veered the other direction, kind of right to Nyanza, which when we were kids we didn't really know what it was. But in those woods, we would be out there in the summer when we didn't have school all day long. You know, it wasn't like now where, you know, we're playing PlayStation and all that, but we had all paths, tree forts, things like that. And also there was ponds out there. In the winter we'd skate there. In the summer we would catch turtles, just walk right in the water, you know, walk in deep. Some of my neighbors were a little older, the Flannerys, who you know, and they'd bring me in there, catch huge turtles and stuff like that. So we were out there, in the summertime we were out there a lot, pretty much all day long.
We do know that he used to skate on Mill Pond, and he did fall in one day and got soaking wet because he had to come home wet.
My white socks would always turn colors, mostly like a bluish or purplish or whatever. And my mother, back then she wasn't worried about anything medically or environmentally. She used to get pissed and that I was ruining my clothes. You know what I mean? She'd come out and say, you know, stop going in the water, you're wrecking your clothes, you're wrecking your clothes. So that's how that was.
So I played softball through high school. My brother played baseball as well, along with football. And I believe David's only exposure was not with a team, but more so after a game with friends, whether they walked through or was with a friend and going to Timmy Tracy's house, they would walk through the woods to kind of get there.
Eventually, it got labeled as one of the 10 worst Superfund sites, one of the early Superfund sites in the nation. And when it hit the news, then occasionally I'd meet some friends and I'd tell them I live in Ashland, Massachusetts. And I said, oh yeah, we read about you. And I said, and then they would go on and talk about, you know, the pollution and the program of cleaning it up.
So they came in all dressed in white. Everything was white. They're all with the masks, if you remember. And they cleared the streets when they took the trucks out. And where'd they take them? Out west and dumped them someplace. And it was eerie.
The desert.
Very, very eerie when they were cleaning it. Yeah.
I think the first time I ever visited that site, I recall being with some local municipal officials, being with some local community activists. I remember Kathy Anderson, who was Senator Kennedy's environmental aide, was on that tour. There were a number of people, and this was long before all of the barrels that would ultimately be unearthed were discovered. And so we were walking along a site that hadn't really fully been understood.
For 60 years, starting in 1917, the town of Ashland was poisoned. Nyanza, a company that manufactured dyes and pigments on a 35-acre site here, simply dumped its chemical waste into the ground. It was a time long before environmental regulations, although residents like Bernie and Marie Kane certainly knew something wasn't right.
Because there was talk of the water turning blue and yellow, and people hanging clothes out, and they were turning colors, and there was something. It was all right around the Nyanza site.
And animals, they would find deceased animals.
Yeah.
Nyanza operated until 1978, and the poisoned land remained untouched for another 7 years, until the EPA gave it Superfund status and named it one of the 10 most toxic sites in the country. The soil and water in and around the Nyanza site was a horrid concoction of hazardous waste.
In the mid-1980s, there was already the Superfund law, so there were already explorations of toxic sites around the country. And in the 1986 amendments to the Superfund law, it was called SARA, Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, there was the provision to set up a research component to look at disease patterns around Superfund sites. And I actually went to the founding meeting of that, which was at the Centers for Disease Control. But it was to be a sort of intermediate agency between EPA, which funded it, and CDC, which already had its own environmental health and environmental investigation units. ATSDR was set up as a sort of in-between agency that would look in specific at Superfund sites and see if there were health problems. They did what they first called public health assessments, and then they also did public health studies or environmental epidemiology studies.
2 summers I played here, you're like, ah, that was great. And then you think, wow, could something have ever have happened then? Or was it later? Or was it before? Or was it then?
This would be a group that was tasked with answering these very kinds of calls, trying to address community concerns as quickly as possible, but to do sort of a triage function, so that somebody was listening and paying attention versus someone calling almost anyone in the environmental health team, and depending on who you got on the phone, that sort of determined the level of service that you got. So this was a new program, and I became the first director of that program. She contacted us. She wanted the state health department to look into this. There had been, I think, some concerns that local officials weren't hearing some of the concerns, and that's exactly the kind of reason that we set up the community assessment program here. And so the first set of work really involved looking at the cancer pattern in Ashland. We had the cancer registry become operational in 1982, so we had some of the first data available from that registry to review. In earlier studies that we'd been involved with, and certainly one of the most notable was the Woburn childhood leukemia study, as young folks at the time working in environmental epidemiology, we had to determine how to figure out whether or not the number of children seemed unusual. How many kids would we expect to have childhood leukemia? We had no cancer surveillance system. We had death data. And ironically, in the case of Woburn, the death data showed that the rates seemed to be consistent with what might be expected. The problem is that at that point in time, nobody knew that the survival rate for childhood leukemia had increased substantially, and so even though the number of deaths was small, the number of children alive with cancer was much greater, but we had no way of knowing that.
You know, it was already designated as a Superfund site, so it was known that there were chemical exposures in the town. But the cancer registry at that time was doing what you might call ecologic studies, just looking at the pattern of cancer for the town as a whole, or sometimes as a pattern in a neighborhood, not looking at, in an analytic way, who was exposed and at what levels.
That would become the tool that later would serve to tell us in a much more efficient way, you know, does the pattern of cancer look unusual, but also do the numbers look out of sync? So, we did a study. We did not see any suggestion that there was a real clear connection between cancer and those types of cancer, the cancers that were elevated, cancer of the bladder and kidney. Didn't look like those two were connected, but these were in older people that you would expect, and that these two diseases are more commonly diagnosed in people of, ages, 50 to 60 and beyond. So we didn't really see a connection. The community wasn't entirely happy that we didn't make a cancer connection. So the study demonstrated or the health assessment demonstrated that there were real concerns about children that may have had contact with the site during the 60s and 70s, and that was the population that probably was at greatest risk of exposure. You couple that information with the earlier information from the expert panel that said, if the picture of cancer changes in Ashland, or if you determine that people at greatest risk of exposure to this site report rare health outcomes, then the state health department should take another look. We certainly needed to confirm primary diagnoses of individuals. These were newer cases, so they hadn't even been reported to the registry yet, so we had to work with a cancer registry to get better information and more complete information. We needed to confirm whether there was a temporal or spatial cluster. And in the case of this, it was more temporal that was the concern, because spatial clustering generally is when you're looking at a small area where people live. In the case of the Woburn example, all of the children lived in one specific neighborhood. But this was the town of Ashland, and this was an area that many children played at. So looking in space didn't seem to be that critical, but really trying to determine temporally, are we looking at something that seems like it could really be related to exposures to this site. And so, it was sort of a series of meetings and discussions with staff that work for me in the community assessment program, meetings with our toxicology staff, because they're the ones that look at things in the reverse. So the epidemiologists look at disease patterns and then try to see if the environment plays a role. The toxicologists look at exposures and then try to see if there's been an impact on health. So it's very important for those two disciplines to work together. So we worked together as a group, and then we decided that it made sense to go to a community meeting. I believe the first meeting was at a room upstairs in Town Hall. The representatives that we asked to sit on the committee are your typical type of folks that you would want to have involved. Oftentimes they're local municipal officials, and typically the Board of Health or a health agent is asked. We also try to get people who are most concerned with the disease or the environmental issue to participate with us. My experience has shown that those are the individuals that are most passionate to try to help. So at the end of the day, when lots of people might forget about a study or something and the health department's still there trying to keep chugging along and get the information, having those passionate people that are dedicated really helps.
I want to see them just get on it. There's a history. It's not something that's brand new. It's been going on for years and years and years. I think they have all the information, and I think a lot of the people in this room tonight can validate that information to the next level.
We learned a lot, and we found something in Ashland that frankly was a gold mine that we have never found in any other community that we've worked in. And that wasn't just Marie Kane, Kevin's mother. That was Marie Kane's knowledge because she worked for the school department. And when I said, very honestly, you know, we've got to figure out how we're going to find these people. I mean, many people have moved away, and I think I even used myself as an example. I said, you know, at that point in my life, I probably had lived in 9 different places. And so, you know, I knew that my high school always had a hard time tracking down wherever I was. They know to go to my parents' house because they knew how to get me. But you know, you know, we had to wrestle with those issues. And that's when Marie Kane actually said, Suzanne, that's not a problem in Ashland. And I said, what do you mean, Marie? She said, we keep track of every person that ever went to Ashland High School. I said, what? And she was right. They actually had records of where everyone was. And being able to cut that piece out probably shaved about 2 years of time off of our investigation. Some of the things that the Community Advisory Committee was extraordinarily helpful with was designing a map that became a tool that was used when we did interviews with people so that we could make sure that they were talking about the same brook, they were talking about the same park, the same area of town.
The map we've just started, so we have a long ways to go with it, but as you can see, there's a concentration in the area of Magunko Hill.
2 summers I played here, you're like, that was great. And then you think, wow, could something have ever have happened then? Or was it later? Or was it before? Or was it then?